and welcome back to Life with Tori Simone. It is me, Tori Simone, and today's conversation, we're going to talk about the history of marriage and the impact it has on modern dating. There's been a lot of conversation around modern dating trends, and a lot of people like to call it a war of the sexes. However, I think that this topic really does need to be discussed in a very practical manner, okay? Because there is a particular reason as to why millennials specifically, like within our generation, there is this boom of a vastly different romantic relationship style and outcome than prior generations, okay? Something that I want you guys to know is that, of course, broadly, majority of this research will be European or Anglo-European historical context, and that's because of the fact that America was colonized by Europe, right? Beyond that, there may be some cultural overlap, depending on the culture that you come from, for those that are listening. However, the majority of this is going to come from a European Anglo context, okay? Now, something that we have to get into is the idea of monogamy. In recent centuries, that's when that became a more popular belief, according to research. Prior to recent centuries, they believed that the familial context was made up of many or different male leaders who had many different women partners, right? And they would be able to have their kids and live within a nomadic lifestyle. As they began to settle down, that's when a lot of these changes ended up coming into place that we are currently and most familiar with. Newer than the concept of monogamy, marrying for love. Marrying for love is something that a lot of research has showed is linked to women being able to choose their spouses, which is more recently, and women being given more rights or earning more rights, okay? The earliest known modern marriage ceremony happened about 2350 BC in Mesopotamia. That's a one man marrying one woman type situation. This institution broadened and was broadly adopted by the ancient Hebrews, the ancient Greeks, and the ancient Romans. And during this time, marriage had nothing to do with love or religion. Okay. And if marriage didn't have anything to do with love or religion, then what was the purpose of marriage? And basically, marriage served two primary purposes. One, it was the transfer of ownership. And two, it guaranteed the identification of the man's biological heirs, which is very interesting because both men and women cheated or had sex outside of the confines of marriage. But oddly, they were just like, listen, we're just more so concerned about being able to prove that the offspring belonged to this specific man. And that's because based off of your birth order and who you were born to, there were certain rights, certain privileges, and certain benefits that you inherited from that person. That's while they were living and also when they passed on, right? But through marriage, women predominantly became the property of their husbands. That was the whole thing. Research shows that in ancient Greece, fathers would say during a marriage ceremony that, quote, I pledge my daughter for the purpose of producing legitimate offspring, end quote. As far as ancient Rome, they had the belief that marriage was a practical means to a sensible end, which is the transfer of property, the transfer of wealth, the transfer of rights and responsibilities, as well as various alliances. You see a lot of marriage that happened for alliances, especially by the time you get into the marital habits of the monarchy, right? That's how a lot of Spanish and English alliances ended up happening. But also during the scope of marriage, there were certain benefits, right? The ancient Hebrews believed that married men were able to have multiple wives, whereas the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans believed that married men could also satisfy their sexual urges with concubines, prostitutes, teen male lovers, right? Which adds a whole lot of context as to why currently you have men that are responsible for taking romantic advantage of everyone, right? It's because from the very beginning, the foundations of romance allowed for men to be able to have access to any and everyone. Because for the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans, while men were out doing these things and handling their sexual desires with people outside of the marriage, wives were forced to stay home and tend to the home. Okay. During which we would end up seeing later on in history that women failing to produce an heir would allow for men to divorce or return them to their families. This is where you see, this is where you can go ahead and put in the historical issues of Henry VIII, darling, being upset that his wives could not produce male heirs and him not being responsible for the fact that men do determine the gender of the offspring. Now, how we ended up with this modern bend on religion when it comes down to marriage happened in the 8th century, where churches started to perform weddings. Prior to the 8th century, many churches stayed out of it. They let marriage be between the people involved and the state, okay? Also during the 8th century, you found an influx of blessings from priests becoming more popular. What was happening during the 8th century? Medieval times, okay? This is where the church began to create and enforce the laws surrounding marriage. They also said that there was no need for permission or familial consent during this time, which is very interesting considering by the time we hit the 18th century, you saw that women became the property of their fathers. But I'm getting ahead of myself, okay? So during medieval times, you didn't need permission or familial consent. There was no need for a priest to be able to do marriages, and you could get married at puberty, right? That's where girls being the age of 12, boys being the age of 14, they could get married and they did not need parental consent. This also changed in the 18th century. Consent to marry could be given via either verbal consent or physical consent via sex. But if you were engaged and you had sex, you were then married. Okay, so the physical act of consummation when you were engaged is what caused you to be married. If you were not engaged and you had sex, this was just you saying we intend to get married, which is a very interesting notion and hair to split, but I digress, okay? There was also no need for witnesses, and divorce was not an option. And we're going to talk about that divorce not being an option once again with Henry VIII, okay? But one thing that you should know is that the Quakers weren't bound to these rules. And that still is the case for today due to their religious practices. The Quakers did not need any of these things, even when laws began to change requiring some of these things. But from 1217 to 1219, you have the English church that added a quote unquote like no joking statute because they were finding out that men were pretending to give gifts that would assume the announcement of marriage, right? Rings, wreaths, and other gifts that would give the presumed intent to marry in order to have sex. And so the church was like, hey, y'all cannot do this even in a joking manner, because if you do it, even in the joking manner, you may be held responsible and liable for the responsibilities and the duties of marriage. Why was this the case? It's because there were a bunch of marriage mix-ups that was happening. Okay, very much bait and switching. And that was the issue with a lot of these laws that were currently in place by the church in the medieval times. It was because there was no way to be able to show proof of marriage. If you didn't have a witness, if there was no priest, if all of these things were not in place, then people could easily say, oh no, we aren't married. I didn't agree to marriage. That's not what was going on. Okay. And so because of that, the 12th century is when marriage became a holy sacrament by the church. They was like, okay, whatever, we're about to fix all of this. Because prior to, you had clergy that was having to make decisions about the legitimacy of marriage. Now enters the divorce of it all. Okay. Henry VIII, the Tudors, that whole time period is always worth the research because, honey, it was a crazy time. You would be gagged, okay, about the things that were going on during that time. I love history because of the foolery. The tea was piping hot back then. So in 1530, you have King Henry VIII, right, who requested a divorce from his then wife. Back then, the Roman Catholic Church was the head of the church and the head of England. Okay, which meant that kings had to go and get approval from the Pope in order to do specific things, including going to war and all different types of stuff. So if you were the Pope, you had more control over England than even their king did. All right. Henry VIII decided he didn't like this because he couldn't get a divorce. Literally, him wanting a divorce had political and religious implications that are still felt to this day. Okay? Because King Henry VIII used to be a staunch supporter of the Catholic Church until the Pope declined his request to get a divorce from his then wife. Then that's when King Henry VIII began to be a major supporter of the Protestant Reformation. Okay, that's when he decided to get off that Catholic train. Why he wanted the divorce? His wife could not have a son. Not that the wife did not have an heir. They were just all girls. And he was like, this isn't going to work for me. I need somebody that's going to have a son. Okay. Not only did he request a divorce, but he then also requested to marry Anne Boleyn. Okay. The outcome, the Pope was like, no, thank you. No, thank you, King Henry. You cannot have this divorce because divorces are not permissible. You could not get a divorce. Okay. So Henry VIII was like, I'm about to go ahead and hop on this Protestant movement. I'm going to become the head of my own church. And I'll also still then be the head of England. And I'll be able to divorce. And that's what ended up happening. Now, when we move from common law to legal marriage, this was the result of the church. And it's called the calling of bonds or banns. That's BANNS. Okay. Or it's the public announcement of marriage, also known as engagement. This started to happen in the 13th century. Okay. And marriage license entered the United States scene for local, at the local level in 1639, and then at the state level in 1641. Okay. This is where you see a major overhaul revealing the husband's dominance and it being officially recognized legally via coverture. And coverture literally means the woman's identity becomes absorbed into her husband's, aka the women lose themselves. It is no surprise that a lot of married women, one of the things that they dislike the most is that they lose their own individual identity. That was not an accident. That was intentional. That was intentional via coverture. And that's what was ruling and reigning over here in the United States. Now, a lot of these laws that we ended up having around marriage was the result of what we brought over from Great Britain, okay? And Great Britain introduced non-religious civil marriage via the Marriage Act of 1836, okay? So by 1929, all states had marriage license laws. And that's something that you have to understand, that marriage license laws are on the state level as well as on the federal level, all right? And when did it become a federal, when did those licenses or marriages have impact on the federal level? That happened in 1913. And that was because of the couple income tax. Okay. Now, also during this time, this was the height of the suffragist movement. Women got the right to vote in 1920. And in 1913, that's when the Federal Reserve Act created the federal income tax. Right? Okay. So now we're starting to see how there has been a switch from it just being something that happened as a legally binding contract to be able to move wealth or be able to have alliances, to now there are more financial implications on the federal level, as well as laws and legal implications as well that become formalized, right? Because all of this other stuff was literally hearsay. It was hearsay up until we started putting pen to paper. All right. Now, marrying for love entered the scene in the 18th century. All right. And for those that don't understand how centuries work, 18th century is the 1900s. Okay. Now, once again, majority of these laws brought from the UK. A majority of these laws were brought from the UK. And these UK laws stated that young women were under the father's control until marriage. This is how arranged courtships ended up happening, right? And that's because women were not considered full citizens because they were considered property. And therefore, they could not make any independent decisions about what happened to their person. So much so that when women became widows because their husbands passed away, all of their wealth and the control over their livelihood and well-being went to their nearest male family member. For those that are Christians, this is what happened with Esther. This is what happened with Ruth, not Esther, Ruth. And Naomi and them, Ruth's husband died. She stayed with Naomi. Naomi said, hey, I know where your nearest male kinsman is. That's your male family member. You need to go and have him be over you. That's what you need to do. Okay. That was her cousin. I digress. So once again, you have arranged courtships that started to spark off during this time because of these laws, saying that young women were the property of their fathers, right? The right to vote for women changed so much, right? A lot of people think about the right to vote just as women being able to express their political beliefs, same as the men. That is not the only thing that it did. It made marriage between two full citizens. Then it further led to the sexual revolution, which changed the interpretation of marriage as saying that marriage could be for mutual desire between both men and women. Because desire and it being mutual was nowhere in the cards. Then in the 1960s, marriage became a right and not a guarded or a segregated privilege, right? This is where you get into Loving v. Virginia, right? Where you're talking about interracial marriages being legalized. 1970s is where America began to rearrange marriage laws. And these years are very important. This background is very important for you to understand what's currently happening in marriages, in romantic relationships for millennials specifically, because millennials is the first generation to feel the main impact of these changes because they were born into this societal ideology. They were not a part of the societal ideology that had to change this narrative. Okay. So from 1974 to 1993, states recognized and banned marital rape, which was a concept that did not exist previously because women were considered property. You could not rape what you owned. And women could not have independent autonomy over their bodies because they were considered the property of either their father or their husbands, or should their husbands pass away, they were considered the property of their closest male family member. It is through this lens that men feel entitled to the bodies of women for generations. Are you understanding what I'm saying to you? From 1974 to 1993 is when men are finally being told, you do not have a right to a woman's body. How many of your parents, how many of your parents were born before 1993? This includes Gen Xers. So during the lifespan of Generation X, men were still able and taught and supported in society to have a right to women's body. For context, I was born in 1991. So it is during my lifetime that men were still being told, and society had just started to change this narrative of men having a right to a woman's body. Are you starting to understand why millennial men are going through the travesty of trying to figure out why they aren't being selected? Why women aren't marrying them? They were raised by men that were raised by men and socialized to be given the right by birth to access to women's bodies. That's why during that time period, you literally have fathers that were taking advantage of their daughters. And you also had women who taught their daughters that it was the man's right to do so. That's where you get this influx of modesty culture that is not only supported by men, but also supported and upheld by women. Are you understanding? Now, we are still finding that child marriage is still an issue in the United States. That is something that has not been dealt with as of yet, because currently it is still legal in 35 states. As of the research that I had that I had pulled. Okay. Now, when we're talking about marriage, the United States also becomes the first country to legalize same-sex marriage. But when we're taking a look at the age of marriage, right? The age of people that are getting married. In 1999, let's start with 1950. In 1950, the average age of a man getting married was 22. The average age of a woman was 20. In 1999, that is 49 years later, almost a full half a century later, the average age of men getting married is 26, and the average age of women getting married is 25. Now in 2025, the average age of marriage for men and women is 32. Now, what can we take a look at to be able to see these marriage norms starting to shift outside of women getting the right to vote and things like that? It is the vanishing of gender education gap that also impacted marriage trends, right? The right for women to get education, which came after women earned the right to vote. That's when the disseminating, or rather the dismantling of the gender education gap began to broadly take hold is after the 1920s, which once again, women became able to vote. All right. That is the ratification of the 16th Amendment, right? Women can now vote. Women are now seen as full citizens, right? 1970s, women are able to have their own bank account. So women could vote, but they still could not take hold of their own property and financial institutions. And one thing that you have to understand is that the passing of a law does not immediately shift the societal narrative for everyone. It still takes generations of this becoming a norm for you to see a broad and vast shift of an entire culture's perspective. So the 1980s is when we start seeing this narrative of women beginning to surpass the education rates of men. And this is almost in all countries, okay? Because in earlier years, the research around marriage for marriages where women were educated, they were considered a higher risk of divorce. Because when you know better, you do better, I guess, right? Yes, that's facts. When you know better, you do better, right? Currently, research shows that educated equals entering a marriage provides for a more stable marriage. That is a dramatic shift. Because prior to, an educated woman being in a marriage with an educated man meant that the man could not enforce the typical control and possession over that woman that society has said he was due. Okay? Now, by contrast, there's this persistent negative association between women's education and divorce. And it stalled the progress of marriage between heterosexuals in relationships and in marriages. And a lot of this data that supports the narrative of women should not be educated in marriage, it is because this data that is being compared is data that is gotten prior to the mid-1980s. Which is when that generation gap began to be pulled away, like began to dissolve. So let's bring it to modern day. You have literally had centuries of men legislating laws, double bound, right? Double bound in legality and in religion that stopped the impact of natural selection, right? Natural selection is the fact it happens when both people are on equal platforms, like they are equal in standing and therefore can make a decision that is mutually beneficial based off of their own equal standing. For centuries, men And it has to be men because men were the only people that could govern legally, right? That patriarchal dominance, right? During that time, only men could lead. So only men could create laws around marriage. And the laws that were created around marriage made for women to be property that was bargained and sold and discarded if it didn't work, right? This removed the process of natural selection, which then led for women to only be able to navigate this space by finding a man to be attached to them. Whether he was nice to her or not, whether she liked him or not, whether she was attracted to him or not, whether she wanted to have sex with him or not, right? None of her desires mattered. She wasn't even considered a full citizen. She was not considered her own property. So the only thing she could do is try to plead with the men in her family to choose someone that she wanted them to choose. But that often didn't matter because the benefit of marriage was for the man because this was his property to bargain with. It was his bargaining chip. And this has happened for generations. We won't even get into slavery. We won't even get into Jim Crow. We won't even get into all of those additional factors that also shaped this landscape of marriage. But keep in mind, 1970s to 1993, that is when the narrative in the United States of America began to change and say that men did not have a right to women's bodies. If I am a millennial that is born in 1991, that means that my male counterparts were a part of a time period where they were told that the only thing that they needed to do in order to be selected was to make money because it was their only obligation to fund the family. They had no obligation to look good. They had no obligation to smell good. They had no obligation to present themselves as a good option or present themselves as attractive to the female gaze or to a woman's gaze until now. And they were raised by men who were socialized in this way, who were also raised by men that were socialized in this way, who were also raised by men who were socialized in this way back hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. And now you have millennial women who are on the most equal playing field that has ever existed. Because Gen X and the younger boomer women were a part of the changing of this narrative, right? Boomer women were pushing the suffragist movement to be able to be considered full citizens. And we understand the dynamic of this conversation when it comes down to race. Okay, we understand that they were not pushing for black women to be equal. Like, right? Like we get that. Okay, we get that. Right? But even in the racial context, black men still were beneficiaries of this patriarchal narrative. Not to the same extent as their white male counterparts, but way more than any woman. To a certain extent, white women had a lot more flexibility against men of color and black men. Okay? But when we look at romantic relationships through the context of its historical implementation, it makes perfect sense as to why these men are losing their minds about natural selection being the main thing that is getting that will get them the attention and the companionship of a woman. That's why they're confused. It's because the lie of marriage was sold to men the same way the lie of education was sold to millennials. And millennial men are not reaping any of the benefits that prior generations of men reaped due to these patriarchal laws that was in place. And that's why the narrative of the conservative easily is acceptable by the millennial men. It's because they feel scammed. They feel conned. They feel duped. And they should feel that way. Why? Because these men were not taught that the only reason why prior generations of men were the recipients of these benefits is because they legislated out natural selection. If they had not legally and religiously legislated out natural selection, older generations of men would have been subject to the same outcomes of current generations of men and boys. And that is a fact. You want to know why? Because that's why your uncle is ugly. Your uncle is ugly and got your beautiful aunt because natural selection was not something that women could participate in because they were considered property. So they could not make any decisions or choices on their own about who they decided to partner with, or nor could they have a reasonable partner that respected them, that cherished them, that loved them, that allowed for them to exist in their own autonomy. Because the men that did that during these generations, those older generations, they were frowned upon in society. They were considered to be less than men, by whom other men and other women that ascribe to this sociological patriarchal belief. And this is the problem with what's currently happening in romantic relationships for this generation. I feel sorry for men to a certain extent because they were lied to unintentionally by prior generations of men. And so now you have men that are having to do the work of trying to catch up societally in order to be married. Why? It's because women begin to change what we deemed as acceptable for our societal place in the United States of America back in the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1960s. Men did not get on board until well after 1993. And that's why there's this huge chasm and difference in the socialization of what is deemed to be acceptable exchanges between men and women in romantic relationships, because men never had to seek the approval of the woman that they wanted to marry. They only had to seek the approval of the men that were around her. And I think that if we actually frame this conversation in the correct context with the correct data attached to it, we may be able to have a better, more healthier romantic involvement amongst heterosexuals between men and women in the future. Make sure that you guys subscribe, share with your friends, and And I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I absolutely enjoyed doing the research for this episode. I absolutely enjoyed talking about this particular episode. And I would love to be able to hear your thoughts.